This podcast is brought to you with the kind contributions of fellow listeners. If you think there is a vast machine at work in the background with assistants, researchers and audio engineers all beavering away, paid for by a philanthropic millionaire, you would be wrong. It's just me, but I could use your help. All this costs me, and it's not just my time. Software and research material are all an ongoing cost. How can I help, I hear you cry? Well, if each one of you tossed a shekel in my virtual tip jar at patreon.com/WW2 podcast, I would have a pretty good monthly salary. But I appreciate not everyone has the luxury of spare change. But if you do enjoy the show every couple of weeks, why not go to patreon.com/WW2 podcast and become a patron of the show? Think of it as like subscribing to a magazine, but rather than a piece of plastic tat that you occasionally get taped to the front cover, I'll try and give you some audio extras from the chats I have, bits left on the cutting room floor. So that's patreon.com/WW2 podcast. Hello and welcome to another episode of the show. I'm Angus Wallace. We seem to have had a few sojourns into the Pacific recently, and during the research, one plane is constantly getting mentioned quietly in the background, the Consolidated Catalina flying boat. It's not something I knew much about. It doesn't get mentioned like other planes that were produced in their thousands. Its distinctive look is pretty iconic to me of the Pacific theatre. Until I started to research, I didn't realise how much it was also utilised in the Atlantic. So today, I'm joined by Matt Dearden. Matt is a commercial pilot based in the Pacific who owns a share in Miss Pickup, a World War II era Catalina flying out of the UK. Thanks for joining me, Matt. Shall we start by looking at the PBY? For those unfamiliar, I wonder if you could describe its appearance.
So obviously Catalina is a flying boat as it's designed, so it can obviously land on the water. Quite distinctively, it's got an absolutely massive wing on it. It's about 104 feet in span, quite a high aspect ratio wing, very similar to a glider, which basically allows it to fly very long distances very slowly, because also its primary sort of purpose as it was designed for was as a spotting aircraft. So it was designed for sort of spotting naval fleets, submarines and that sort of thing far out in the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. It doesn't have any flaps on the wings, which is unusual for an aircraft of that size, because it doesn't need them. It flies incredibly slowly. Its stall speed's about 60 knots, which is sort of similar to your little GA aircraft that you see at a sort of flying club and that sort of thing. So it's an unusual shape, I suppose. It's got those two big blisters on the back there. Again, for its primary purpose as a spotter. Those blisters there offer a fantastic view of the world around you.
That wing across the top, it's a parasol wing? Is that correct? Is that what it's called?
Yeah, that's right. The wing across the top there is what they call a parasol wing, as you said. So it's supported in the middle of the airframe by the sort of tower, and then it has these four struts that come out from the bottom of the fuselage, just below the engines, or just sort of outboard of the engines there to give it a bit of structural integrity. So the whole fuselage basically is suspended underneath that wing there, much like a hang glider, other than it doesn't obviously move, which, affords it that sort of ability to sort of gracefully glide through the air at sort of slow speeds, spotting submarines and warboats and things.
And you mentioned it didn't have ailerons on the wings?
No, it's got ailerons, as all aircraft need, because that obviously allows you to steer. But it's flaps, basically. It doesn't have flaps, which on most aircraft, certainly anything a bit fast, like a Spitfire or a Mustang or anything like that, and even quite a number of bombers, obviously, too. They have flaps to slow them down so they can take off in a shorter distance and also land in shorter distances. But because the Catalina is such a slow aircraft, it just doesn't need the complication of flaps. So they didn't design them into it.
I always assumed flaps were actually for going up and down and not just braking. I thought they were sort of in my ignorance.
They increase the lift basically of the wing, so it can fly slower and still produce some kind of lift. But obviously when you got them out, you have to fly slowly, which you don't really want if you're flying a Spitfire. You want to be able to go quickly, so they retract to allow you to go fast.
By not having them, does it add anything to the aircraft, if that makes sense? I mean, does it increase lift dynamics, aerodynamics, or anything?
No, basically by not having flaps, it just makes the aircraft a little bit simpler. It's one less thing to go wrong, really. Obviously, if you have flaps and things, then on larger aircraft, something that size, it would probably be hydraulic, and that'd be more things to go wrong, really. So, as it doesn't need them, it doesn't have them.
I mean, you obviously touched upon it there. About the role of the aircraft. I mean, it was designed in the 30s by the Americans. What roles did they envisage it for, and what roles did it actually end up ultimately being used for?
Well, I mean, I suppose its original design was very much as a sort of surveillance aircraft, sort of patrolling borders and keeping an eye out for that sort of thing. And obviously with its design such that it can be slow, but also has huge range, huge endurance. The fuel tanks on board on the sort of standard one is about 730 gallons a side, which gives you something like 20 hours airborne, allowing you to fly about 2,400 nautical miles. So there's huge range to it. But obviously during the war it was pressed into service as a lot of it was anti-submarine kind of things, sort of spotting them and actually also bombing them. They could throw torpedoes and depth charges and that sort of thing from the aircraft to actually attack submarines. But also they were obviously quite commonly used for search and rescue. Obviously being a flying boat, they can land on the water there. So if an aircrew has been downed by a fighter of some kind, they can fly into their position, into their life raft, land next to them, pick up the aircrew, and then take them back home to safety. So, I think the sight of a Catalina for many of those guys would have been quite a welcoming sight.
Wouldn't it, when they're just sort of bobbing about, lost? Their use in the Atlantic, I mean, to me, they're famously used in the Pacific, but that anti-submarine role, I wonder how effective they were. Dropping torpedoes, one would assume, would be quite a challenging task, because you'd have to come in low, get it lined up and drop them.
I certainly believe it was quite hit and miss, really. I think they were more sort of spotting the fleets and the submarines and then directing, obviously, other Allied fleets to go and then attack on that position. But certainly they had been known to sink submarines and also warships. Certainly during the beginning of the Pacific Theater, I believe, it sunk a number of Japanese ships way out in the Pacific. And initially the Japanese assumed it was another boat. They didn't envisage that an aircraft could possibly be so far away from shore. So it took them a little while to cotton on to the fact that the Allies had these sort of capable aircraft that could come out and do this and actually attack their fleets.
Well, certainly with an operational range of 2,000 or 3,000 miles, and you're on
2,400.
You absolutely miles from nowhere, and especially if you're slowly creeping along for 20 hours. I mean, that must be a real endurance mission for the crews. I mean, how big were the crews?
And also, I mean, it was quite a large aircraft, so it did have a reasonable sized crew. I believe the minimum was something like 9, and sometimes they sort of double up on some of the roles there. So up at the front there, you'd have the sort of turret gunner. He would just be forward of the cockpit there. So he'd operate the 2 machine guns on the front there. But he'd also be the bowman. So when they landed on the water, he would then throw the rope out to the tender or onto a buoy to sort of moor them up, as it were. And then obviously just behind him, you've got the cockpit. So you've got the 2 pilots there, captain and co-pilot. And just behind them in the forward area, you've got your radio operator and your navigator. Some of them also had a radar operator there, although obviously that came later into the war. And then just below the wing, in the large tower where the wing is supported onto the fuselage, that's where the flight engineer would sit, getting deafened by the massive radial engines there. Further back at the rear of the aircraft, where the 2 blisters are, you'd have a gunner on either side there, who'll also be the spotter. Obviously, those blisters allowing those guys to have a good view of the world out below them. And then some of the later ones also had a tail gunner who'd sit at the back there with a fixed machine gun as a sort of defence role, really, to try and ward off attacking fighters.
The flight engineer, once in flight, I mean, how much could I actually do? I mean, I presume they could just monitor the engines. Is there any other role for them? I mean, it's always... I've slightly wondered what their role was.
Yeah, I mean, that was the sort of primary role, really. So they would have in front of them a huge panel of all the engine instruments, showing the sort of standard things of oil pressure and temperature and all this sort of thing. And yeah, that was his primary role, was to keep an eye on that and sort of change their settings as required by the pilots. The pilots weren't tasked with any of that sort of stuff. They were literally just there to fly the aeroplane. So their instrumentation was very basic. They also have got a navigator behind them who's telling them the headings to fly and that sort of thing. And a radar operator then to talk to people on the ground. So pilots did very little other than just fly the plane, get it airborne and land again. The engineer was the guy looking after the engines and that sort of thing, which is quite an important job because obviously if they stop, then you're in trouble.
It is. I mean, what controls do they have, the flight engineer, over the engines? Can they, just fuel mixes or, put fires out on them, presumably?
Yeah, I mean, he would have that sort of thing, obviously being able to put the fires out on the engines. But yeah, he'd have the mixtures, the power settings, propellers. He'd have full control of the engines, basically. The pilots were only given very limited control. They could change the power and the propeller pitches, but they wouldn't even start the engines. The engineer would be doing all of that. He'd start them up and shut them down at the end of the flight and that sort of thing. It's
an involved role. I just presumed that the pilot, once in the air, was in charge of everything. It was handed over to him.
Yeah, I mean, even if you look at sort of commercial airplanes, gosh, it wasn't until I guess around the 80s or so that flight engineers started to become less common. You look at your old TriStars and all the old original Boeing 747s and Concorde and all these kind of things. They also had the flight engineer because it was in those days there was no real computers, so he had a huge array of instruments to try and monitor. Which, if you're trying to fly an airplane, that's not the easiest thing to be able to do, really. So you had to have a sort of an extra person to do that.
Was it the flight engineer that would be in control of the fuel tanks? Switching the fuel over?
Yeah, he would definitely be doing that because the Catalina's got two main tanks, and which you can feed both engines from one tank or one engine from either tank or swap it over the other way around. So if there's any kind of problem with the fueling in that regard, then yeah, he would obviously look after that. And a lot of the ones that were on the really long-range missions, they would also have external fuel tanks, which again you'd have to be able to transfer the fuels appropriately. And so yeah, I mean it was a pretty important job really, and certainly took away that responsibility from the pilots, who could then just concentrate on flying it.
My uncle, who was on Sunderland's, it's just brought to mind a story he told me not long before he died about how they were on submarine flights, and he said it was essentially quite boring. It's probably quite late in the war. And the flight engineer had dozed off and failed to monitor the fuel, and they ran out of fuel, and he was poked awake by my uncle, who was a radio operator. Realised what was going on and swapped the fuel tanks over. I mean, I'm not quite. That sounds more dramatic than it might or might not have been. I have no idea, but there's a story he told me not long before he died.
It certainly wouldn't surprise me. I don't know what the Sunderland system, but obviously they had 4 engines, so I imagine you had lots of fuel tanks as well. And yes, it probably wouldn't be impossible to accidentally run out of fuel on one of the fuel tanks and have one of the engines or even multiple engines go quiet on you. Before you suddenly scupper to life and try transferring the fuel to the appropriate engine. Yes, it'd certainly be a wake-up, I imagine.
Yeah, it would be. He said after that, they didn't report him, but after that the radio operator was tasked with prodding him every 15 minutes to make sure he was awake. So we do have some gunners on there, but this, one doesn't like to say the word lumbering, but it flew at, 100 miles an hour? Are we cruising?
Yeah, the cruising speed is... obviously depends on your altitude a little bit, but roughly about 125 miles an hour is their sort of standard cruise. Because they would normally fly quite low. Obviously being spotting aircraft, there's no point sitting at 10,000 feet because you're not going to see too much. So they come down a little bit lower than that. And yeah, they're not very maneuverable. No kind of aircraft of that size in those days could do anything like what the fighters could do. So, you can sort of imagine certainly in the Pacific, as they were sort of flying along, if they came across an aircraft carrier, Japanese fleet, then they could be in real trouble because quite often they were by themselves. A few little machine guns is not really going to compete against a multiple number of Zeros coming in on you, I don't think.
But potentially maximum sort of 4 gunners, that's not exactly a great defence. And their sailing for flying was not that high either, was it?
No, I mean, it's about 16,000 feet, and the fighters would have been more than capable of coming up to that kind of altitude. So I don't think that would have really been their escape, to be honest. Yes, I guess they just had to kind of hope that they didn't come across or have a fighter escort, I suppose, if they were thinking that they might potentially come across enemy targets. But it's unlikely that anyone's going to be able to come out as far as they can, so it's generally we're just on their own.
In that respect, it's quite frightening. I wonder how many of them were shot down or left alone, or I don't know. You're kind of on your own up there. Presumably, they might have a better option of putting down in the sea if injured, but that's still you're bumbling about in the middle of nowhere on your own, hoping someone else is there to pick you up.
Yeah, and sadly, yeah, it's happened. Catalina sitting on the water had just been strafed by Messerschmitt or something, and sunk. And that would be the end of them.
So the later model, the PBY-5 is the amphibious model. So just as war broke out, they added wheels. Why did they feel the need to add wheels? Does it add much to it?
Well, actually, sort of the designation PBYs 1 to 5, they were all pure flying boats. It was the 5A and 6As, A meaning amphibious, that basically, when they decided to put the wheels on there, I think that was quite sort of midway in the war, about 1941, something like that. Once you start putting wheels and things on there, the biggest compromise is that you add weight to the thing. Not so much the wheels themselves, but also all the kind of stuff that goes with it, hydraulic systems and all that sort of thing. And it adds about a ton to the weight of the aircraft, so I suppose it would also restrict your load capability, so maybe a little bit less bombs, a little bit less fuel, or things like that. But obviously they decided at that stage that it was of much more benefit to be able to land on the land as well as in the water.
I wonder if it changed its characteristics, flying characteristics, much adding wheels. Because adding a ton of weight is a lot.
Yeah, I mean, it's a reasonable whack of weight, but I mean, Catalina's weighed somewhere around about 12 tons or so, and I suspect they probably got even heavier during the war. It wouldn't really affect it too greatly, and certainly not aerodynamically or anything, because it's still the same sort of shape with all the wheels retracted, so it should still fly exactly the same. But actually, interestingly, that's a little anecdote I got, is I met a navigator a few months ago at an air show on the flying boats, the pure flying boats. And he always said that they actually looked down on the amphibious ones as non-pure. So there was always a bit of a running joke, I believe, in the back in those days between the ones with wheels and the ones without.
And but the wheels and the floats retracted?
Yes, that's right. Obviously, to streamline the aircraft a little bit, both the wheels and the floats could be retracted into their respective positions. The wheels obviously go up into the fuselage. Floats actually fold up into the wingtips. So if you look at a Catalina in flight, it's quite a sort of graceful shape, really, because there's not really much sticking off it, like a lot of bombers would have extra sort of things sticking out of them, but the Catalina is quite sort of pure in that regard. And obviously, if you want to land on the water, you would fold the wingtips down. There's a little switch in the cockpit there. You just push the switch, and then the floats drop down electrically and lock into place. Whereas if you want the wheels down, you pull the big lever there, and hydraulics kick into life, and out come the wheels. So obviously you have to make sure which one you were landing on, water or land, and make sure you got the right one. But
actually, the one thing we've not mentioned is Catalina. Do we know why it's called a Catalina?
No, I don't really know. I mean, I assumed it was something to do with the British kind of naming convention back in those days. Obviously Dakotas and Harvards and all this. We all had our own little names for these things, but I've always assumed it was to do with the island there. But I don't really know, to be honest, and no one's been able to sort of tell me exactly why they're called Catalinas. I've not come across anything that actually explains that satisfactorily.
Nothing I read instantly jumped out at me of why it was Catalina, but I was quite surprised. PBY, what's PBY stand for? Which is it's the American designation, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the Americans always had a habit of giving aircraft and I think everything really just different designations. So PB was patrol boat or patrol bomber, I think. And the Y was just the manufacturing code for consolidated aircraft. Canadian Vickers also built Catalinas, although they called them Canzos. So I think there was something like PBV, V for Canadian Vickers.
V for Vickers makes much more sense than Y for Consolidated, the US manufacturer.
Yeah. You'd have to ask someone. I don't know.
I was about to start suggesting things that I am just pulling things out of thin air, so I'll just shut up on going down there before we go around that rat hole of nonsense. So let's look at the one that you fly. What's the history of the one that you fly?
The one that we fly is actually technically a Canzo, as I touched on just now. Is built by Vickers, Canadian Vickers in Quebec. And so she was built in 1943 and then saw service with the 9th Squadron at Bella Bella on the British Columbian coast between Vancouver and Prince Rupert. She didn't do a huge amount, I think. I mean, obviously that was quite late on in the war there, so she did a few sort of patrols and that sort of thing. And then after the war, she was sort of pressed into service as a freighter initially, and then as a water bomber, which a lot of flying boats ended up in that sort of a role, really, because obviously being a flying boat design, they can land on the water there. So they would basically put big water tanks inside the fuselage, little scoops on the hull underneath, and they would sort of touch and go on the water there and scoop up a huge amount of water, and then just be able to drop it over forest fires and that sort of thing, which is good for us, I suppose, because it means they've still had a use after the war. I mean, so many of the fighters, bombers, what can you do with a Mustang at the end of the war, really? I mean, it just ends up as someone's plaything, really. So yeah, I did a lot of water bombing initially in Canada, and she ended up in France and did a fair whack then as well. Before I think then coming back to Canada, where she sort of mothballed for a little bit. And then she was bought by a chap who wanted to use her for sort of safari flights in Zimbabwe and places, I believe. After the war, obviously, as I said, she got converted to a water bomber, so they removed the blisters off the back there to obviously streamline the airframe a little bit, and you didn't need to have those in there anymore. But obviously, the chap who wanted to do these tourist flights in Zimbabwe, he wanted to put the blisters back on, but he elected to put these sort of modified ones to the originals. The original ones with these sort of framed doors that you could actually open and close and stick guns out and that sort of thing. But the ones on our particular aircraft, they're actually perspex, and actually a little bit larger than the original ones, which is great for if you're inside flying, because you get this fantastic view of the world with them. This chap ran out of money, and so we acquired her in 2004, and then flew her back to the UK, where she basically started doing air shows, really. I mean, the first season she was still in those crazy colours when we bought her, so she was sort of yellow with green stripes and red kind of wingtips and accents and that sort of thing, as many fire bombers were, obviously, to sort of make them quite visual. But then, basically, after the second season, just before the second season, we decided to obviously paint her in something a little bit more appropriate, warbird style. So she was then painted all white, as you see her today, with the blue star on there and everything. And she's basically representing the US Air Force's Catalina 44-33915 of the 8th Air Force 5th Emergency Rescue Squadron, which was based at Halesworth in Suffolk. We kind of felt it was nice to have an aircraft that was obviously had a UK base, as it were. Yeah, she was called Miss Pickup, which is the little motif you see on the side of her now, because that's the original one was actually sunk doing exactly that. She was picking up a bomber crew out in the North Sea there, and unfortunately a Messerschmitt 109 spotted her and gunned her down basically while she was still on the water. And sadly the original was lost, but she sort of carries on today as our aircraft.
How difficult are parts to come by to keep her flying? Not
too bad, thankfully, because obviously they continue to use these kind of these flying boats, Catalinas, after the war for quite a long time. I mean, I can't think when the last one would have been retired, probably somewhere around about the 80s or so. So there was a sort of continuation of parts being made for them. You can even today still buy the tyres somewhere down in South America for the main gear. But yeah, I mean, certain bits are a little bit more tricky to get hold of. The engines are very common. They're the Pratt & Whitney twin radial, twin Wasp engines. And these are the same engines fitted to the DC-3 Dakotas. So very common, basically, and they're still flying today, the number of those. So there's plenty of engine parts, which is always the trickiest thing, really. Other things you can sort of manufacture and things, but obviously engines have a lot of parts inside them. We actually have a spare engine for our aircraft, which we sort of rotate. So whilst that's being serviced, and the other two are obviously on the airframe, and we sort of rotate them around as required.
Do you still land her on water? Presumably you don't land her on salt water because it'll probably play havoc with the airframe, but is she still fully landable on water? Amphibious, I suppose is the term.
Yeah, I mean, we do still land her on water, and as you say, we don't land her on salt water anymore, just because of the corrosive nature of salt water. It absolutely wreaks havoc with things, and although she's a very tightly sealed hull, it'll still get in places that you just will never be able to get it fully out, and it will just cause all sorts of corrosion issues, not to mention the damage it does to the engines. Despite the fact they're so high off the water there up on the wing, they still get the spray, and salt spray going into the engines is not good at all. So she's an old girl. She's 73 years old now. We try and baby her as best we can, basically, and so fresh water only.
Have you landed on water? How much different is it to land on water than landing on land?
I have actually. I've got the land and the sea ratings for her now. It's It's a lot of fun, I can tell you that, and it's quite hard work. It's a little bit different. Normally when you land an aircraft on the land, as you're sort of coming down onto the runway there, you'll sort of pull back on the controls to arrest the rate of descent and touch the wheels down and make a nice greaser of a landing, as they say. But on water, you can't do that, because what you have to basically do is come down in the sort of correct attitude, as if she was going to be sort of cruising along the water on what's called the step. If you ever look at a speedboat or something like that, you see them sort of power up and the boat almost leaps out of the water and then just skims across the top. And so that sort of attitude is what you're looking for when you land the Catalina on the water. You want to be in that same attitude. So you don't pull back on the controls as you touch the water. You literally the water just greets the bottom of the aircraft, and then she sits on that water. And then you just maintain that attitude as you're going along, as you close off the throttles to then slow her down and just keep maintaining that attitude. And eventually she drops off the step, and then you're sort of settled on the water there. Takeoff, it's quite interesting, because it's sort of a flying hull, as they say, a flying boat hull. There's no water rudders or anything like that, so we don't have any steering as such, other than the fin on the back of the aircraft. But obviously that needs to be moving along for it to actually have any effect. So the only way we can really steer is actually just using the engines, a little bit of power on one engine versus the other, sort of go around in circles and that sort of thing. Certainly initially, and once you kind of get going, then obviously the rudder has authority. But the big thing is you can't stop on the water. There's no brakes, and the engines are always producing thrust. So you're always kind of cruising along at about 2 or 3 knots or so. So you've got to be very aware of where things are, because you can easily sort of cruise into a tree and that sort of thing if you're not paying attention, basically. But as I said, it's a lot of fun. It's really rewarding from a pilot's point of view to get to do that sort of thing.
I hadn't realised how actually it's just it's not a boat. It doesn't have a rudder, as you say. It's actually navigating on the water must have a huge body of water to deal with to actually turn around and get ready, because there's no sharp turns. You must gently have to come to a halt unless you're throwing some sort of anchor off the back. Yeah,
I mean, that's the thing, and certainly if you are operating off the water, you have to have all of those things in mind. I mean, obviously back in the war they were operating off the sea there, which, huge expanse of water, but they didn't generally sort of taxi around on the water. They would generally land, and a tender would come out to them, and they'd throw a rope out to the tender and get pulled in, or they'd taxi up to a buoy perhaps and anchor themselves onto that. They don't really have any control, or very little control on the water. So you can do things like, you can put drogues out to sort of try and increase the drag on one side and that sort of thing. And also actually with the amphibious ones, like our one, you can actually put the wheels down individually to try and increase the drag on one side or the other side to basically try and compensate for crosswinds. Because if you've got a bit of a wind blowing, all it wants to do is weathercock into the wind. The big fin on the back is like a sail. So as the wind blows, it wants to just point itself into the wind, and anything above about 10 knots or so, it's almost impossible to control it, because it will just want to just keep pointing into the wind.
How much of a mill pond does it have to land on? Obviously, when you're landing on an airfield, it's pretty flat. I mean, do they need mill pond to land on? Presumably, you must have take some sort of waves, but how extreme can it be?
Back in the war, I think they were really pushing these things. I sort of mentioned that we kind of cruise ours down in a sort of a nice attitude to settle onto the water. Back in the war, they wouldn't have been quite so kind to the airframes, I don't think. They sort of did these sort of stall landings, which basically meant as they got just above the water, they would pull back on the controls and just stall the whole hull straight onto the water, so it would stop almost instantly, which obviously allowed them to land in some significant kind of swells. Quite how they get airborne again, I'm not entirely certain. We kind of restrict our aircraft to about 2-foot swell. It's a reasonable size swell. I think there's some stories in the war of, waves big enough that they sort of crash over and flood the engines and that sort of thing. So you have to kind of imagine, considering how high it is off the ground, how big those swells must have been.
2 foot seems quite substantial to me. Presumably it would be quite a bumpy ride coming down in 2 foot.
Yeah, I've never landed it on anything other than sort of freshwater lakes, so it's always been quite sort of smooth, really. But I've played around with speedboats and things, and you can, you sort of skip across the waves, and I kind of imagine that's how it is with the Catalina as well. You just skip across them.
We've said that we're going on these 20-hour missions. When you're inside it and you're in the pilot's position, how comfortable would it have been when you're sitting there? How much of it you empathise with the pilot who's having to sit there for 20 hours? Is it comfy? Have they put a lot of coffee cup holders there for you and everything?
Yeah, we wish. No, I think pretty much with most wartime kind of aircraft and vehicles, they would sort of all design for a sort of purpose, and then afterwards they say, oh yes, we've got to put people inside these things too. So it always seems to be an afterthought, as far as I could tell. There's plenty of things to knock your head on and knock your shins on and all that sort of thing. And the seats themselves, I suppose, are not too bad. But yeah, I mean, there's no insulation or anything like that inside the aircraft. It's just a thin bit of aluminium between you and the outside world there. So, you'd be very much affected by the temperatures, either really hot temperatures in the Pacific there or freezing temperatures over the Atlantic. So yeah, certainly not the most comfortable of aircraft, and very tiring to fly because they're very noisy. Those radial engines droning away there for hour after hour after hour. And, the guys, certainly from pictures I've seen, they didn't seem to wear any proper hearing protection, that we have today with noise-cancelling headsets and this sort of thing. So, the majority of them would be pretty deaf by the time they've done a mission, I imagine.
Are there many left flying?
As far as I know, it's somewhere in the region of about 10 or so that are sort of airworthy, as it were. But there's probably only about 3 or 4 that sort of continually fly, such as ours. And I believe our one is the one that flies the most each year, most active, as it were. Most weekends we're doing an air show somewhere in the UK or Europe. So it's, certainly does the most hours each year, I think.
So where's your base? Can people come and visit it?
Absolutely, yeah. So she's based at Duxford, the Imperial War Museum there, just south of Cambridge. This time of year, she'll still be out and about in September, but sort of come winter time, she'll then go into the hangar for the winter maintenance, where you can sort of see her in lots of pieces. But yeah, certainly during the sort of summer seasons, about March, April onwards, she's out there. And yeah, you can come and have a look at her. And if you get lucky, you might see one of us doing a practice display or an engine run or something like that. And
it's always frightfully thrilling to see them actually running. I have vague recollections as a child, seeing the D-Day memorial flight, but not when it was actually an impromptu. For some reason, we used to be on a flight path for when they were going up and down the country, and my dad would always get frightfully excited when they would, oh look, there they are, and it'd be somewhere north of us as they rattle up from Lincolnshire where they're based. And it's seeing the all. Oh
no, it's always great, when you see them.
It's magnificent.
I remember when I was learning to fly, actually watching the Lancaster take off at Bristol Airport. I was just coming in to land, and there was the Lancaster just taking off there, and it's absolutely magical. Just you actually hear them on the radio as well. It sort of takes you back to that time as well. It actually almost sounded like 1940s wartime pilots. I'm sure they must do it deliberately, but it's brilliant.
You professionally fly in the Pacific on where are you?
I actually fly in Indonesia on the New Guinea island in what's called Papua these days. So that's the western half of the New Guinea island there, just north of Australia, just literally south of the equator. Yeah, you get a kind of a feel for what the guys would have been doing. I mean, there was certainly a lot of wartime airfields around. I mean, I fly into a few of them, Biak, Merauke, Sentani. These are all airfields I've flown into, which are still active today as commercial airfields. Obviously, on the New Guinea side, there was Port Moresby and a few others. And yeah, it's a challenging place to fly an aircraft even today. It's typical tropical jungle-y kind of weather. So 30-odd degrees on the ground, huge thunderstorms in the afternoon, lots of kind of clouds and fogs around, and huge mountains. The New Guinea Islands. On the Papuan side, there's Cartan's Pyramid, or Puncak Jaya as it's known today, which is a 16,000-foot high mountain with snow on it. It's got a huge glacier there. It's the only one in the tropics with that sort of temperature contrast, that you get snow at that altitude and then down at sea level it's stinking hot jungle. So yeah, you certainly get an appreciation of what it must have been like for those guys.
And you'll be navigating with the aid of GPS. So in those days, presumably it's dead reckoning, and if you're out for 10 hours out and 10 hours back, and then you've got weather closing in, which presumably you can only see it. It's not as if it's coming. Navigation must have been crucial.
Basically, as you said, navigation would have been dead reckoning, certainly during the day. Obviously at night time they would have had the celestial stars and sextants and that sort of thing, which I imagine probably would have been a little bit more accurate. But I think they got pretty good with their dead reckoning. They'd obviously have to eyeball the winds and that sort of thing. But obviously knowing the speed of your aircraft and having an accurate stopwatch, you could be pretty accurate to where you were going. Quite how they managed it, flying out over miles and miles of ocean, not entirely certain. That would have been some pretty spot-on navigating. You'd have to speak to one of those boys to see quite how they managed to pull that off, intercepting Japanese fleets and that sort of thing.
I wonder if how the old World War II aircraft got on with the conditions in the Pacific, because presumably modern ones will all be much more resilient, presumably to the climate, and they'll no doubt factor in things. I mean, I wonder if how well they, or if they, if you got tanks in the desert and they had different filters and things. I wonder if they did anything in the Pacific to make them specifically for the Pacific, or if they there's too many specifics and Pacifics there in that sentence for me to get it out.
It's a good tongue twister, isn't it?
I wonder if they did anything particularly to the aircraft fuel mix, or anything, because it's such a hostile environment, because you've got a lot of temperatures to deal with when you're going up from presumably altitude and down to the ground again.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's hard to say exactly. I mean, the aircraft designers, I'm sure, would have factored in these sort of things when they were designing them. But yeah, I mean, the Catalina, obviously, like quite a few aircraft, was serving on sort of both theatres. You've got the Atlantic one there, which is obviously much colder, and during winter would be downright hazardous. I mean, it has no anti-icing equipment or anything like that, so you'd have to make sure you didn't fly into those kind of conditions. And obviously in the Pacific there, you've got the huge temperature differences, 30 odd degrees at sea level down to, depending on how high you go, when you went up to 16,000 feet, it would be probably just under sub-zero temperatures. As to how that affects the aircraft, I mean, I presume it's certainly going to take its toll on the airframe if you, over the years, as it were, and all the missions that those guys actually did with them.
Have you ever flown a modern seaplane? I wonder how they compare. I mean, we don't really build them like we did. There's smaller things on floats now, aren't they?
No, I mean, the flying boat fell out of favour, basically. I mean, you had, was it Imperial Airlines or Imperial Airways, sort of before and after the war, were quite sort of popular, because in those days, if you wanted a large aircraft and you wanted to take a lot of things, you needed a huge runway, and we just didn't have runways that big, so a flying boat was a logical solution to it, because then you can just use the sea, and obviously it doesn't matter how long the runway is then. But obviously as technology advanced, even during the war, we could design aircraft that could still take a huge load and land on regular runways. And so, yeah, the flying boat fell out of favour. So it sort of became a bit more of a hobby aircraft, really. I mean, they still have water bombers. That's still very much a role that flying boats are used for. But yes, as you said, most of them now are just a lighter aircraft, smaller planes, which have been fitted with these sort of pontoons, floats underneath there. I've not flown one myself, but I think they're probably a little bit easier, because they do have things like water rudders and that sort of thing, so you can actually sort of taxi around on the water and steer yourself. So, they've kind of added those sort of things in, I guess.
That seems to be a fitting place to finish. Thank you, Matt. For further information on Miss Pickup, you can go to catalina.org.uk. I'll put a link on the website. That's www.podcast.com. And for the next couple of weeks, I'll post some Catalina-related stuff on the Facebook page. Just search for WWII Podcast. So until next time, I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.